Oscar Wilde once said, "Nowadays people know the price of everything and the value of nothing." Well, Raj Patel is trying to change that. Born in London, Raj is an academic and activist. At one time, he worked for both the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. But over time, he decided the developed world had an unfair advantage, which forced developing nations to fight an uphill battle for a share of wealth and prosperity.
Let them go! Let them go!
So, Raj switched sides to protest against the organizations he once worked for and got hit with tear gas along the way. Basically, Raj believes the free market system is flawed and does more harm than good, because it hides the real price of goods to consumers and covers up the damage done environmentally and socially. His goal is to level the playing field, rebalance society, and offer a new way of thinking.
Everybody, say hello to Raj Patel. Welcome back. Pleasure to have you. Thank you. It is a fundamental pillar. It's a pillar in people's lives, the idea to complain about how much stuff costs. But then when you get a chance to educate yourself and see how things are made, sometimes your opinion changes. So for you, how did you decide that this is what you wanted to look at?
Actually, the reason I wanted to look at prices and value was because everything went horribly wrong a couple of years ago. And we had this moment where Alan Greenspan, the smartest man in the world, the man who'd been advocating for the power of free markets, was suddenly forced in front of Congress to say, there is a flaw in the model that I thought was working very well for the past 40 years.
And when he says that, everybody else goes,
well, no one did. The thing was that it's a massive. It's like the Pope saying, God, we just made him up. It's like the Pope saying, God, we just made him up. Doesn't even have a beard. It's a mystery to most people what the Commons is. If you look at I grew up in Britain where the House of Commons. If you try and derive what the House of Commons is by watching the House of Commons, it's a drinking club for white men. The Commons is, it's both the resources that we share, but also the management of those resources together.
The moment anybody talks about something like the Commons, everybody hears communism. They hear something that it isn't. And so I suspect that's a big part of this conversation, is how do you get people to let their dogma go to see what's really there?
Well, this is it. I'm not a communist. I'm just open-minded. I'm not a communist. I'm just open-minded. I'm just open-minded.
So as I was watching this show, I couldn't help but realize how masonry, how masonically the stage was set up. And I began to pay attention on how they both sat on kind of square. So I began to look in the background, and I noticed these numbers, 1723. And so I thought to myself, this must have some significant meaning. So I began to do the research. I came across this film called 23, starring Jim Carrey. And it reveals some very interesting clues. I continued researching, I came across this organization called the Hellfire Club. Benjamin Franklin, he was a prominent member of the Hellfire Club.
America was born in rebellion, and a few of its greatest icons made alliances with the host of hell. In the late 1700s, a group of Englishmen formed the first Hellfire Club, a fraternity dedicated to drinking, sex, and at times ridiculing Christianity and mocking its sacred rituals. Members met at ruined monasteries to revel in black masses and drunken orgies. An occasional participant was the American ambassador to Great Britain, Benjamin Franklin.
The Hellfire clubs were satanic, or perhaps pseudo-satanic exploitation of clubs frequented by young members of aristocracy, which engaged in often violent and sometimes murderous pranks against unfortunate victims with impunity because of their social standing and economic position. Drinking and whoring were also standard activities in these clubs. The Hellfire clubs took debauchery one step further by adding black masses and other satanic rites to their repertoire. Now, what ties this in to 1723 is a Freemason and a close friend of Duke of Wharton of Britain, Earl Rose, were instrumental behind establishing the Dublin Hellfire Club. He was elected as he secured the election as Grand Master of the English Grand Lodge and served in this position from 1722 to 1723.
Raj Patel quotes a British philosopher and a poet named Oscar Wilde, and it's on the forward of his book and his commercials.
Over a century ago, Oscar Wilde observed the gap between prices and value. And today, amidst our economic and ecological crises, the discrepancy couldn't be greater. It seems like every aspect of our lives is touched by the philosophy of prices and free markets. But isn't there a better way to value our world? Growing up, my parents had a convenience store. My favorite thing there was the price gun. Especially when I got to make my own prices. And of course, I knew the exact value of my little brother. As a kid, that was a joke. But given our current crisis, when we see this as more valuable than this, when most people can't afford this, but they call this a value meal, where a tomato farmer gets paid less in a year than a Wall Street banker gets in an hour. It seems as if the joke is on us. So how do we get here? From the 1970s onward, our economy was hijacked by free market fundamentalists whose mantra was greed is good, regulation is bad. But it gets darker still.
I encourage you all to go shopping more.
We were all along for the ride. We bought, ate, and drove more, and paid for it with debt, diabetes, and pollution. We mortgaged our future and called it freedom.
I found a flaw in the model that I perceived is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
In other words, you found that your ideology was not right. It was not working.
Precisely.
So, if all of us got it wrong about markets and greed, then what now? The opposite of consumption isn't thrift, it's generosity. The oldest civilizations and the latest neuroscience agree that we're not just selfish.
So who is Oscar Wilde, and what is the connection to Raj Patel? Well, I did more information and research, and I came up to these interesting facts.
I have made a wonderful discovery. I find that alcohol taken persistently and in sufficiently large quantities produces all the effects of intoxication.
He was funny. He was the funniest man who ever lived. I mean, you know, how can you say anything more than that?
Oscar Wilde's writing made him famous, but his life was his true work of art. He kept dinner tables hanging on his every word. His plays ran to packed houses. Wilde brought color to the gray of Victorian England with both his words and his appearance.
It opened the doors and windows on stuffy Victorianism and let in, you know, a breath of, well, not exactly fresh air, but certainly very different air.
And in a time when you could be thrown into jail for committing homosexual acts, Oscar Wilde defended himself against a prejudiced and hypocritical England.
If you're a little advanced of your age, you always end up being burnt at the stake.